My name is Gerald Foster. I'm 81 years old, a former security systems specialist. For half a century, I designed alarm systems for banks, museums, and government facilities. I held codes that even the Pentagon didn't know existed. But now, after I buried my wife, my daughter thought it appropriate to throw a party in our home. She said, "Life goes on." She changed the alarm code to her birth date. She didn't know the house was still mine, and that the code was only the beginning. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Gerald Foster. I was 81 years old, and my joints felt every hour of it that morning. For 37 years, I had designed security systems for federal buildings across the country. Vaults, courthouses, embassies, places where failure was not an option. I was precise, methodical, and trained to expect betrayal where others saw routine. But nothing in my years of circuit diagrams and breach simulations had prepared me for the silence that follows the burial of the person you built your life around. That morning, I sat on the porch, wrapped in a knitted blanket my wife had made during the winter of '86. It had dulled with time, but the pattern still held. A stubborn array of deep greens and blues, she said, reminded her of the Maine coastline. The wood beneath me creaked with each shift of my weight, and the breeze pulled gently at the loose ends of the blanket, like a child asking for attention. The rocking chair moved just enough to remind me I was still here, while everything else had left. The funeral had ended 2 hours earlier. The last of the cars had rolled down the gravel drive, trailing dust into the golden morning. Some left handshakes, others casseroles. My daughter gave neither. She had come in a tailored black suit and left before the pastor finished his prayer. There had been no tears, no pause at the casket, no hand on my shoulder. Just a quick glance toward her phone, as if the next thing mattered more than the last breath of the woman who raised her. I didn't follow her. I stayed until the groundskeeper gently closed the gates behind the procession. Then I returned to the porch, like a man returning from war, with no one to report to. The air smelled of cut grass and damp soil. Somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's dog barked once, and then fell quiet again. The stillness was too clean, too hollow, as if the world had vacuumed itself free of sound to avoid dealing with grief. Inside the house, the faint scent of her still lingered. Rosemary from her pillow, a trace of lavender on the collar of her robe, the ghost of cinnamon in the kitchen drawers. But I couldn't bring myself to go in. Not yet. The porch had been our place, the neutral ground where we met in the early mornings with coffee, or late at night with tea. We'd talk about everything and nothing. Weather, squirrels, whether the hydrangeas needed pruning. Now the silence pressed against my chest like lead. I looked at the garden she had tended with such devotion. The daisies leaned slightly to the right, thirsty and untrimmed. The bird feeder hung crooked from the oak, forgotten after her last fall. Even the wind chimes sounded off-key. Everything she touched had started to unravel in her absence, as if the house itself was resisting the idea of continuing without her. My knees ached as I shifted in the chair. I adjusted the blanket around my shoulders and stared at the driveway. It was cracked in the same 3 spots it had been for a decade, each one widening with time. I had always meant to repair it, but she said the cracks gave it character. "Let things age," she used to say. "Let them tell their story." I never argued with her on that. Now I wondered if the house would still speak without her voice inside it. A squirrel darted across the porch railing and paused to inspect me. We stared at each other for a moment, 2 old creatures unsure of what came next. Then it ran off into the dying leaves. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for my thermos. The lid gave its familiar metallic click, and I took a sip. The tea had gone cold, but I swallowed it anyway. It was the same blend she had brewed every morning for the past 30 years, Darjeeling with a splash of honey. I hadn't liked it at first, but over time, it had become part of the rhythm of us. Now it tasted like memory and metal. I thought about going inside, about facing the hallways we had painted together, the pictures we'd hung, the kitchen she ruled like a gentle tyrant. But I knew what I would see. Her slippers by the bed, untouched mail on the foyer table, the book she had been halfway through resting on the arm of her chair. If I opened the door, time would start again. It would demand movement, choices, new patterns. Out here on the porch, I could still pretend she was inside, just asleep, just resting. The sun crept higher, casting long shadows from the porch beams across the floorboards. I watched as light fell onto the doormat she had chosen last fall. Welcome friends in faded blue. She had said it made the house feel less lonely, even when we were alone. She was always planning for guests, for laughter, for continuation. I wondered if she knew how final her goodbye had been. She hadn't spoken the morning she died, just a gentle squeeze of my hand, eyes closed, breathing shallow. I had counted her breaths until the rhythm broke. I didn't cry. Not then. Not yet. There would be time for that later, in the places she couldn't see. Somewhere behind me, a car passed on the road, and then was gone. I felt the vibration in the planks more than I heard it. The world kept moving, and I remained still. It wasn't until the shadows shifted that I realized how long I had been sitting there. My back stiffened, and I unfolded slowly from the chair. The blanket slid off my shoulders and onto the seat. I let it rest there. As I opened the screen door, I paused. My hand lingered on the frame. The metal was cool, and the mesh had frayed near the top where she used to push it open with her elbow. I traced the tear with my finger. Then I stepped inside, carrying the silence with me like a second skin. I woke to the sound of music that didn't belong in the house. It wasn't playing through the dusty stereo system in the living room or humming softly from the kitchen radio my wife used to leave on for the birds. It was thumping, deep, low bass that made the windows vibrate in their frames. My first instinct was confusion. Then came the sting of disbelief. It had been less than 24 hours since I buried my wife, and already the walls were dancing to someone else's rhythm. I sat up in bed slowly, letting my body creak its way into motion. The sunlight filtered through the blinds in long, segmented lines, slicing the floor into bars of light and shadow. The room smelled stale. Her side of the bed still held the shape of her absence, and the air around me felt heavier than the blanket on my legs. I swung my feet down onto the cold floor, took a breath, and reached for my cane. The hallway outside my bedroom was oddly quiet. The music didn't bleed through here. It was focused elsewhere in the house. But there were other sounds. Footsteps above me, creaking down the staircase, the soft laughter of unfamiliar voices, and the unmistakable clink of glass on glass. I moved slowly, following the trail of noise like a hunter tracking an animal he didn't want to find. When I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed something strange. The door to the dining room, which I always kept closed, was ajar. That door had a particular resistance to it, swollen slightly from age and humidity. You had to tug it with care. Now it hung open like it had been used a dozen times already this morning. I paused there, feeling something shift inside my chest. Not anger, not yet, just something colder, a splintered curiosity. As I stepped into the foyer, I immediately noticed changes. The photographs on the console table had been rearranged. The one of my wife and me on our anniversary trip to Nova Scotia had been pushed to the side. In its place stood a polished glass decanter filled with what looked like champagne. I followed its stem down to the floor, where a trail of glittering gold ribbon curled like a sleeping serpent. Beside it lay a party horn, unused, but waiting. I turned toward the living room and froze. There were balloons, not just one or two, dozens of them, in shades of white and blush and champagne gold. Some were anchored to furniture, others floated in clusters near the ceiling. Streamers hung from the mantel like vines. The fireplace, where her urn still stood, had been draped with a garland of artificial roses. On the coffee table were half-empty flutes, lipstick-stained and glistening with condensation. A cake, 3 tiers, pink frosting, with cursive writing I couldn't quite read from where I stood, rested under a glass dome, like a relic from another life. My daughter's laughter rang out from the kitchen. I could hear her voice mingling with others, loud and bright, full of energy that felt almost violent in its joy. I didn't move toward the noise. Instead, I turned back to the decanter. I picked it up carefully, studying the way the light refracted through its surface. The stopper was halfway loose, and with the gentlest motion of my thumb, it released with a soft, distinct pop. That sound, the cork separating from glass, was sharper than any scream I had heard. That sound had no place in this house today. I didn't pour it. I didn't drink. I simply held it, thinking about how quickly a place can change when its soul has been removed. My wife's presence had always been an invisible perimeter. She maintained the sanctity of the home like a quiet sentry. Without her, the walls became hollow and the rules evaporated like morning mist. I placed the decanter back down, carefully aligning it with the edge of the table. My fingers brushed against a folded napkin, white, embossed with gold lettering. A single word, bold and stylized. Celebrate. It sat like a challenge, daring me to object. I left it there. I moved through the house slowly, examining what had been altered. The vase she used for fresh flowers now held cocktail straws. The piano, once closed and quiet, had an iPad resting on it with a party playlist queued up. Her favorite armchair had been moved into the corner to make space for folding chairs. On the chair's seat lay a jacket that didn't belong to anyone I knew. There were shoes by the door, heels, sneakers, boots, a variety of lives that had been invited into this space without my knowledge or consent. I looked up at the hallway camera, one of several I had installed years ago for peace of mind. It blinked green, still recording, still watching. I made a mental note to download the footage later. In the kitchen, I stood just beyond the archway, unseen. My daughter stood by the island, holding a mimosa and laughing with a man in a crisp button-down shirt. She wore a dress that shimmered slightly in the light. Silver, short, stylish. The kind of dress people wore to brunches, to birthdays, not to mornings after funerals. The refrigerator door opened and closed. Plates clattered into the sink. Someone popped another bottle. The cork hit the ceiling with a dull thud and fell into the sink with a splash. I didn't step in. I didn't interrupt. Instead, I turned and walked back through the house, back into the hallway that still felt untouched. I stood outside the master bedroom door and placed my hand on the handle. The brass was cool, steady. Inside, the room still waited, still held its breath. I opened the door and stepped inside. The air was still and smelled faintly of her perfume, jasmine and something I never could name. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my hands resting in my lap. I listened. I heard music, laughter, glass clinking, footsteps, life. Uninterrupted, unapologetic. And I felt something settle inside me. Not resentment, not quite. Something closer to calculation. The sensation of edges forming, of a plan sketching itself out in the quiet folds of my thoughts. I had spent my life designing systems to protect what mattered. I had spent decades anticipating the moves of others before they made them. I knew how to wait. I knew how to listen. And above all, I knew how to make a house speak again. The garage had always been mine, a space untouched by decoration, unspoiled by trends. My wife had claimed the kitchen, the flower beds, the sunroom with her books and tea and embroidered pillows. But the garage was different. It smelled of oil, rubber, and time. It held the scent of labor and the quiet breath of tools that remembered what they had been used for. No one ever entered it without purpose, especially not my daughter. That morning, I walked across the back patio in my house slippers. The concrete was cold and pitted, textured from years of rain and sun, and my own hesitant repairs. The key to the side door of the garage hung behind a loose brick beside the hose. I had hidden it there nearly 2 decades ago, and never once mentioned it. The brick shifted with a dull scrape, the key still nestled in its dust-slicked notch. I took it with the same precision I'd used to lift pressure plates out of armored safes in my younger days. The door gave a stubborn groan as it opened. Inside, everything waited in silence. The fluorescent tubes above flickered once, then came to life with a soft hum. My eyes adjusted slowly, sweeping across the room like a guard inspecting the perimeter. On the workbench, my old soldering iron, still coiled in its stand, a disassembled motion sensor unit, a tangle of labeled wires in transparent bins, a cracked coffee mug filled with nails. Everything exactly where I had left it, though coated now with a film of time. I moved toward the center of the room and let my hand rest on the top of my tool chest. It was heavy, dented, scratched, and stickered with remnants of a life I barely recognized. A U.S. Security Expo 1997 badge peeled at one corner. A fading label read, "Foster Systems, Confidential." My fingers traced the grooves of the drawers, sliding one open to reveal screwdrivers in a meticulous line. Another housed copper coils, thermal tape, and unused sensors in their factory foam. I breathed in, and the smell of rust and plastic filled my lungs. The floor bore my footprints now, soft smudges against a decade's worth of settled dust. The space beneath the workbench was darker, untouched. I knelt slowly, knees popping with each inch, and reached beneath until my hand closed around a small wooden box. It wasn't locked, just latched with an old brass clasp that had tarnished green around the edges. Inside lay several rolls of blueprints, each marked with red pencil and dated in my own hand. I had drawn these at the tail end of my career, when the government was still calling, but my wife had begun to hint that she wanted me home more. I unrolled one and stared at it on the bench. A basic home security layout with modifications for redundancy, a triple-loop failsafe, infrared beams layered over pressure sensors, and a fallback analog trigger in case of full electronic compromise. I remembered designing it late at night, half out of curiosity and half out of habit. I never installed it. I had told myself it was overkill for a family home, but now I wasn't so sure. I wiped the dust from the blueprint with my sleeve, the grit catching in the fabric and scraping faintly against the paper. My nails were already rimmed in dirt. It felt like digging, like exhuming something that had been buried not out of shame, but out of patience. I pulled open the cabinets beneath the bench. Coils of wire spilled into the light. There were old motion detectors, pressure mats, analog timers, doorframe magnets, wireless cameras no bigger than a coin. I checked each one with a methodical hand, setting aside what still worked. Batteries I'd replace. Connections I'd resolder. But the bones were intact. The system would live again. I found my notebook inside a drawer beneath my thermal imaging scope. Leather-bound, corners frayed. Every page a diagram, a calculation, a note to self. I flipped through it slowly, finding sketches of our own house from decades ago. The layout hadn't changed. My daughter hadn't knocked down walls. She had only filled the rooms with noise and wine glasses and empty laughter. Good. I tore out a blank sheet and began mapping. The entry points, the blind spots, the weaknesses. I noted where the cameras would go, where the wiring could be concealed behind existing molding, where I could install a fail-safe beneath the breaker box. I sketched a route for the fiber line that would link the system to a remote server. I still had the equipment. I had kept it all. Not because I thought I'd need it, but because some things don't deserve to be thrown away just because someone else can't see their worth. I worked for hours. The physical movement brought heat back into my limbs. My hands remembered. My wrists fell into old rhythms. The click of the screwdriver, the press of the connector, the hum of diagnostics. I found a kind of silence in it that didn't ask questions or pretend it wasn't alone. At one point I looked up and realized how late it had gotten. A thin beam of sunlight pushed through the grimy garage window, catching the edges of dust in the air, like golden static. I watched it shimmer, then fade as the sun shifted. My fingers were black with grime, the ridges under my nails packed with years of forgotten residue. I ran a rag over my hands, but the dirt clung to the creases. It felt right. I pulled out a small circuit board and set it on the bench. I leaned close, soldering iron in hand, and steadied my breath. Each dot of solder sealed more than a connection. It sealed a decision. I would not allow the house to forget what it had been built for. I would not allow her, my daughter, to rewrite its story with champagne toasts and careless codes. When I finished, I stood back, letting the circuits cool. My legs ached. My shoulders were stiff, but my mind was awake in a way it hadn't been in months. I stored the new components in a padded case and placed it back beneath the bench. I closed the cabinets, locked them, and slid the key into my pocket. The dust on the floor was marked now with new trails, fresh, confident, unhidden. The house had changed. Now so would I. The attic stairs groaned like an old man's knees as I pulled them down from the ceiling. Dust fell in a fine gray mist around me, catching in the shaft of afternoon light from the hallway window. I stood at the bottom for a moment, hand on the wooden railing, staring up into the dark. That space had been untouched for years, more her domain than mine. She kept her photo boxes, her seasonal decorations, the extra linens up there. I rarely had reason to climb those rungs, but I knew what I was looking for now, and I knew exactly where it was. I climbed slowly, my breath shallow in the stale air. The wood strained beneath my weight, but held. At the top, the attic opened around me like a cave, filled with the smell of insulation, cardboard, and aging fabric. The temperature was several degrees warmer, and the only light came from a single bulb on a pull chain that swung like a pendulum when I brushed against it. I pulled it. A faint yellow glow settled over the clutter. The boxes were stacked neatly along the walls. She had labeled them all in careful script. Christmas, books, old clothes, kitchen extras. There was comfort in that, in her organization, in the way she had tried to keep the past contained. But I wasn't here for decorations or old scarves. I moved past the rows until I found the box I remembered. A large plastic storage bin labeled Photos Plus VHS. The lid had warped slightly, but it opened with a tug. Inside, chaos reigned. Envelopes from drugstore developers spilled their contents in faded forsythists, rubber-banded stacks of prints, a few sleeved negatives, and beneath it all, at the very bottom, lay what I came for. An old black camcorder, thicker than a brick, wrapped in a soft cloth like something sacred. I unwrapped it carefully and turned it over in my hands. It was heavier than I remembered, the grip sticky with time. Inside the cassette compartment, I found a tape already loaded. I removed it and set it aside. There were 4 more tapes in a plastic sandwich bag, each marked only with a date, each covering weeks or months that spanned the final year of her life. I took the whole box down with me. It took both arms, and I had to pause halfway to catch my breath. Back in the living room, I set it on the coffee table, swept aside a stack of unopened mail, and plugged the camcorder into the wall. It took a moment, but the screen flickered to life, blue at first, then static, then a paused frame. The backyard. Early spring. My wife in her gardening gloves, kneeling by the azaleas. She turned her head slightly in the frame, unaware of the camera. Alive. I pressed play. The footage ran without cuts, no edits, just long, uninterrupted glimpses of ordinary days. She watered plants, trimmed roses, wiped her hands on her apron. In one shot, she sat on the porch steps, sipping from her thermos and staring out into the trees. The camera must have been mounted somewhere, or perhaps I had left it recording and forgotten. I didn't remember these moments, but they remembered me. As the tape continued, I fast-forwarded until I began to see others. People. At first, just shadows in the background, then shapes, figures. My daughter appeared, her posture different than I remembered, confident, commanding. She wasn't visiting to help. She wasn't tending to her mother. She was inspecting the place, walking through rooms with a notepad, gesturing to things. At one point, she opened drawers in the kitchen and took photographs with her phone. She lingered over the contents of the china cabinet, the same one we had moved in together on our 15th anniversary. She looked at it the way people look at auction items. I paused the tape. The room was silent. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, but inside, the house held its breath. I switched to another cassette. The date on the label was just 2 weeks before the funeral. I loaded it into the camera and hit play. This footage was darker. Evening, maybe. Grainy. My daughter again, but this time she wasn't alone. A man followed her, someone younger, wearing a suit jacket with no tie. They moved through the living room, laughing quietly. She showed him the fireplace, the staircase, the hallway. At one point, they stood in front of the bookshelf where we kept family albums, and she pointed to the wall, then made a gesture like knocking it down. He nodded. They were planning something, not mourning, not remembering. Planning. I watched the tape all the way through. I didn't blink much. I didn't need to. Everything I saw only confirmed what I already suspected, but the confirmation had weight. It gave shape to the unease that had been threading through me since the day I stood on the porch in that blanket. Now, it had a body. Now, it had movement. I rewound the tape and set the camcorder aside. My fingers hovered over the tapes like they were matchsticks, and I was holding a flame. I had spent my life capturing evidence for people who needed proof. Clients, prosecutors, corporations with something to lose. But this was different. This wasn't for court. This was for the house. For her. For everything we had built in this space with our hands and time and ordinary devotion. I gathered the tapes and placed them into a lockbox I kept behind a false drawer in the hall cabinet. It clicked shut with the same mechanical finality I had trusted my entire life. Then I went back to the photo bin and sifted through the prints. Most were of vacations, birthdays, grandchildren we barely saw anymore. I looked at our faces, younger, in sunlight, in kitchens, in gardens. My wife's eyes were always searching, even in joy, looking past the camera, looking forward. I found one photo of my daughter as a child, sitting in her mother's lap, fingers curled in her sweater. Her face was round and open, still untouched by calculation. I stared at that face for a long time, trying to reconcile it with the woman on the tape. There was no connection anymore, only resemblance. I put the photo away. Evening settled over the house. The light turned amber through the windows. I turned off the camcorder, unplugged it, and returned it to its wrapping. I placed it in the back of the closet, behind the coats no one wore anymore. Then I went to the kitchen and turned on the light. I opened the drawer where we kept the candles and pulled one out. I lit it on the counter and let it burn for a while. It didn't change anything, but it made the silence warmer. By the time the evening sun bled out behind the trees, the house had changed again. Not visibly, not in its paint or furniture or fixtures, but in the way it breathed. I could feel it in the floorboards, the way the air moved between rooms, the timing of the creaks and sighs. Something had shifted in its pulse, and I no longer assumed it was my imagination. I had spent most of my life designing spaces to betray the presence of others. Banks, labs, secure archives. Even the Pentagon had paid attention to the way I layered silence with information. This house had become no different. It had become a system, one I now had to debug. After dinner, a quiet affair of dried chicken and a slice of toast I barely chewed, I went to the hall closet and opened the narrow drawer behind the coats. Inside was the control panel I had installed 15 years earlier, buried under a false board and covered in old linen. A relic, but not obsolete. I unscrewed the plate with careful hands and exposed the circuit layer. Dust had softened the solder joints, but the power cable still blinked faintly. Red, steady. That meant the root system was still active, passive but listening. I pulled out my notebook and opened to a blank page. I began listing the zones: entryway, garage, back door, dining room window, motion detector in the hallway, pressure sensor under the front rug. All had been dormant for years, set to bypass while we lived peacefully. Now I reactivated each node one by one, reconfiguring them into my temporary server hidden in the basement utility cabinet. I bypassed the old network and routed signals to my own secure channel, one I could monitor in real time without interference. The moment the system came back to life, the house started talking again. The first signal came at 11:47 p.m., a single blip, Zone 3, kitchen entry door. The camera feed showed nothing but shadows, but the pressure mat registered a weight shift of 143 pounds. I watched it in silence from the old monitor in my study, the green outline of the doorway glowing faintly on the screen. Then it vanished. No exit, no sound, just the one-step pressure, and then silence. A glitch? Possibly, or someone testing boundaries. I logged the event and waited. At 2:12 a.m., another signal. Zone 6, main hallway. No doors opened, no windows shifted, but the motion sensor blinked, twice, then held steady for 12 seconds before fading. I reviewed the feed in reverse. A faint outline, a silhouette, standing still just beyond the bathroom archway, not moving, not crossing, just standing. The timestamp confirmed it. My daughter had returned. She hadn't told me. No calls, no text, just materialized back inside the house she had treated like a showroom 2 days earlier. I watched her on the grainy feed as she moved through the hallway in socks, holding something in her hand, possibly her phone. She paused outside the guest room. The door didn't open. She stared at it for several seconds, and then turned back down the corridor. I didn't intercept her. I didn't leave my study. Instead, I initiated the silent loop, the system's oldest feature, my personal edition, built long before commercial systems adopted it. It was designed not to prevent entry, but to catalog intent. Every movement from now on would be archived, not just in motion logs, but in compiled pattern clusters. She wouldn't know she was being tracked unless I wanted her to. The sensors no longer triggered alarms. They created a map. I watched her enter the kitchen and turn on the light. She opened the fridge, pulled something out, and leaned against the counter. The overhead camera caught a clear image of her face. It looked relaxed, focused, as if this was her place, as if the kitchen had belonged to her longer than it ever had to her mother. She poured herself a glass of something and drank it slowly. Then she pulled a drawer open, twice, 3 times, searching. She opened the cabinet under the sink. She paused. Then she moved toward the den. That was when I activated the secondary filter. The house had certain blind spots, gaps left in design, either intentionally or by architectural limitation. I had long ago hidden pressure switches beneath specific floorboards, embedded thin conductive strips behind certain frames. The den was one of those places, too far from the central router for conventional signal, but close enough for analog detection. I waited until she stepped onto the rug. The reading came through. 142.7 pounds, 4 seconds of stillness, then movement toward the bookshelf. She touched the frame. I saw her hand linger on the edge. Then she turned off the lamp and left the room. At 3:06 a.m., she exited through the back door. No lights, no noise. The system registered the weight drop and the slow return to equilibrium. I noted the time, shut down the active feed, and logged the footage to an external drive. Then I sat in silence. The house was awake now, fully alert. The signals would continue, I knew. Most would be small. Some would be deliberate. Others, false. Like the 4:19 a.m. ping in the laundry room, where no one had been in months. The dryer shifted by 0.3 inches. Temperature in the room rose by half a degree. I checked the feed. No visible disturbance. Could have been a rodent. Could have been her. Could have been nothing. I marked it anyway. That was the rule. Record everything. Assume nothing. By dawn, I had compiled a full 6-hour report. Every zone had activity. Lights turned on, then off. Doors opened slightly, never fully. A wine glass appeared in the sink that hadn't been there the night before. A framed photo of my wife had been moved half an inch to the left. These were not random actions. These were calibrations. She was testing the house, measuring its reactions, as if she knew something had changed in its bones. She wasn't wrong. By mid-morning, I had restructured the system to send push notifications to the secondary monitor in my bedroom. No beeps, no sounds, just a vibration and time stamp. I kept the device under my pillow. At breakfast, I drank my coffee slowly, letting the silence thicken around me. I left the glass from last night unwashed in the sink. I left the hallway light on. I left small clues, echoes of movement. Let her wonder. Let her try. The house was mine again, but now it was listening with my ears, watching with my eyes, responding with the discipline of a man who had spent his life preparing for the moment when truth no longer rang a bell, but crept quietly down a hallway and touched what it thought was forgotten. I spent the morning in the basement. The air there held the weight of years, cool, still, and heavy, with the smell of dust, concrete, and slow decay. The single light bulb above flickered faintly, but it was enough. I didn't need brightness. I needed familiarity. That place had been mine once, long before it became a storage area for broken fans and forgotten holiday decorations. It had been a workroom, a sanctuary of silence, the place where I could think without interruption. And it still remembered me. In the far back corner, beyond the empty canning jars and rusted shelves, sat the trunk I hadn't opened since my retirement. It leaned slightly to one side, as if the weight of its own contents had shifted over time and made it buckle. A thin film of spider webs clung to the metal handles. I crouched slowly, my knees resisting, and brushed the dust away with my sleeve. My hand found the latch, and with a click that echoed louder than expected, the suitcase opened. Inside lay everything I had chosen to keep when I walked away from the career that had defined me. Not the awards or plaques. That kind of recognition dulls quickly. No, what I had saved were the blueprints, the field notes, the prototypes, and the journal. It was there, just as I remembered it, leather-bound, scuffed at the corners, and heavy with the weight of secrets that had never made it into official reports. I picked it up and sat down on the cold floor, legs stretched in front of me, the journal resting on my thighs like a relic. I opened it slowly. The first page bore my name, handwritten in black ink. Underneath it, a date, June 14th, 1978. I had started this journal during my first government contract. I flipped through the pages, each one a memory wrapped in diagrammatic lines and tightly written thoughts. Schematics for private homes, sketches for pressure sensor arrays, flowcharts for internal alarm triggers. Everything documented with the calm precision of a man who had been taught to anticipate failure and design against it. Toward the middle of the journal, I found the plan I had been thinking about for days. A personal project I had never completed. I had called it the Silent Mirror. It was a full-spectrum environmental monitoring system, one that collected data not just on motion or entry points, but on behavioral patterns inside a space. Where people stood, where they hesitated, how they moved through a house when they thought no one was watching. It recorded subtle shifts, temperature anomalies, air displacement, even the timing of footsteps. It was overkill for a residence, but it wasn't built for strangers. It was built for betrayal. I studied the diagrams, mentally mapping them onto the structure of my house. Every hallway, every corner. I would need to modify certain entry points and reroute several circuits, but the framework could be laid down quickly. I pulled out a yellow legal pad from the bottom of the suitcase and began listing what I needed: optical sensors, motion indicators, sound traps, decibel filters. Most of it I already had. Some would need to be rebuilt, but the foundation was solid. Beneath the notebook, I found the other contents of the suitcase, small items that still held power. An envelope full of signed NDA agreements from the security firm I had helped shut down in 1989. A hand-drawn map of a test facility in Nevada, with annotations in my own hand. A signed letter from a general whose name no longer meant anything to most people. Each item was a memory, but also a tool. A reminder that I had once built systems that people trusted with their lives. And now, I had to build one again, not for others, but for this house. For myself. As I set the journal aside, I noticed something else tucked into the lining of the suitcase. A photograph. It was folded twice and yellowed at the edges. I unfolded it carefully. It showed me and my wife, standing outside our first apartment in Arlington. She was holding a box labeled kitchen, and I had a drill in my hand. We were laughing. The moment captured was so mundane, yet now it felt like something sacred. I stared at it for a long time, then slid it into the front pocket of my shirt. Back at the workbench, I pulled open the drawers and began selecting the components I would need. The wires were still coiled neatly, labeled in faded marker. I sorted through the connectors, piezoelectric triggers, miniaturized cameras, and IR filters. The tactile nature of it brought back a clarity I hadn't felt in years. My fingers moved with memory. I didn't need a manual. My hands had written it. I began soldering around midday. The iron hissed and sparked, the smell of burnt flux rising into the basement's stillness. I worked without breaks, without music, without distraction. Just the rhythm of assembly, the quiet calibration of purpose. The world upstairs didn't matter. The plans unfolding in my daughter's head, whatever script she was writing for this house, were irrelevant. Because I was now writing one of my own. As the components came together, I began to construct the sensor modules, small enough to be embedded behind picture frames, under floorboards, inside air vents. Each would feed into a central unit, a repurposed CPU from a decommissioned system I had acquired during a government surplus auction 15 years ago. It still worked. I had kept it because something inside me must have known this day would come. By the time evening settled into the windows above, I had completed 4 of the 7 modules. My back ached, and my fingers were stiff, but I felt clean in a way I hadn't in months. There was no grief here, no confusion, only clarity, purpose, the kind of emotional silence that came from doing something that mattered. I packed the components into a padded box, then closed the suitcase once more. I wiped my hands on an old cloth and looked around the basement. It was darker now, the light bulb casting long shadows across the walls. But it didn't feel lonely. It felt ready. Before I climbed the stairs, I turned back one last time to glance at the closed suitcase. Its surface was scratched, and the old airline sticker on the side had faded beyond legibility, but it stood where I had left it, steady, full of the past. I left the light on as I went upstairs. Some rooms deserve illumination, even when empty, especially when empty. The attic had always carried a particular kind of silence. It wasn't the casual quiet of a living room after midnight or the respectful hush of a hospital corridor. It was a dry, hollow silence, the kind that made you aware of your own movements, your own breath. Every step on the wooden boards above the ceiling sent an echo ricocheting through old beams and dusty air. I hadn't been up there since the last storm season, and even then, it had only been to check for leaks near the eaves. Now I was returning for something different, not to inspect, but to observe. I pulled the ladder down just after midnight. The creak of the metal hinges was sharp, drawn out like the sound of a slow confession. I waited at the bottom step, hand gripping the rail, listening for any change in the house's rhythm. Nothing stirred. No doors opened. No floorboards shifted below. The house was still, or pretending to be. Climbing the ladder took effort. My knees barked with every rung, and my back protested the angle. At the top, the trapdoor resisted slightly, the wood swollen from time. I leaned into it with my shoulder until it gave, and the attic opened above me like a slow exhale. The air was warm and dry, thick with insulation dust and the faint sour scent of old cardboard. A single chain dangled from the ceiling, connected to a bulb that flickered once before, casting a muted yellow light across the space. It didn't reach the far corners, but it was enough to see what I needed. I stepped inside and let the hatch fall shut behind me. Boxes lined the edges, just as I remembered. Some were labeled in my wife's handwriting, neat cursive on strips of masking tape that had browned at the edges. Others were unmarked, forgotten long ago. Old baby clothes, tax records, unused gifts from birthdays that no one remembered clearly, a few suitcases, a folded crib, the long plastic bin that had once held Christmas ornaments but now contained a tangled mess of extension cords and burnt-out bulbs. But what drew my attention wasn't any of that. It was the smell. Something had changed. It was subtle at first, buried beneath the layers of dust and time, but it was there, newer, sharper, a mix of perfume and plastic, a scent too clean, too artificial for a place like this. I moved carefully toward the far side of the attic, where the light grew thinner. I passed the chest of blankets, the stack of old National Geographics, and reached the narrow built-in closet that had always been more decorative than useful. The door hung slightly ajar. Its hinge, once stiff, had rusted through along the top pin, giving it a slanted lean. I reached out and touched the edge. My fingers came away orange-brown. I opened it slowly. The squeal that followed was loud, jarring, and long. No hiding that sound. But still, the house stayed silent. Inside the closet, stacked neatly on a wire shelf, were several cardboard boxes I didn't recognize. They were new. No dust. No labeling. No crumbling corners. I opened the top one and found it full of decorations. Balloons, party banners, ribbons, unopened bags of plastic confetti. Gold, white, and blush. A soft pastel color scheme that had nothing to do with mourning. I picked up one of the banners. The lettering was pre-cut foam, the kind you see strung across Instagram-ready mantles. It read, "Cheers to New Beginnings." I placed it back in the box and opened the second. This one was full of printed photos, not of our family, not of the house, but of her, my daughter, with people I didn't recognize. They were staged shots, cocktails in hand, posed in front of backdrops, smiling in curated joy. One caught my attention. She stood in our living room just behind the couch, laughing with a man whose hand rested on her shoulder. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was the edge of the fireplace mantel, where my wife's urn had once stood. I set the photo aside and opened the third box. Inside were files, printed property valuations, real estate agent brochures, a handwritten budget on hotel stationery with my address written at the top, followed by projected renovation costs. One-line item: demolish attic, replace with open loft space, clear out old man's junk. The words were underlined twice in red pen. I stood there a long time, holding that sheet of paper in my hands. It was light, but it felt like lead. My eyes scanned the rest of the page. No mention of preservation, no mention of family, just margins and profits and checklists. I returned the page to the box and closed the lid. Near the back of the closet, tucked behind the boxes, I found something else, something smaller. A plastic crate filled with wine bottles, all unopened, expensive labels, foreign names, a celebration stash. I counted them. 12 bottles, enough for a dozen people to toast to the end of something, or someone. I stepped back and let the door fall shut with a dull thud. The rusted hinge moaned again and settled into silence. I sat on an old trunk beside the closet and let the weight of the moment press into my chest. The attic had been a space of preservation, a room where memory was stored carefully, if not lovingly. But now it had become a staging ground. I leaned my back against the trunk and stared up at the beams above. Dust floated in the soft cone of light like drifting ash. The bulb flickered once more and held. Everything around me had changed. Not suddenly, not loudly, but over time. Erosion by intent. The past had not been buried. It had been boxed and labeled trash. And that was when I knew. There would be no conversation, no confrontation. There would be no emotional showdown in the kitchen or tearful apologies by the fireplace. This was not that kind of story. What had been broken would not be glued back together. It had to be replaced, restructured, recoded. And I had already started. I stood, knees aching, and walked slowly back to the hatch. Before I descended, I turned once more to look at the rusted hinge, a small, insignificant detail. But it had warned me. Hinges fail when they're ignored, when their creak becomes part of the background. That sound was no longer background. It was the signal. It was still dark when I woke. Not just early, dark. That specific depth of night where the house feels like it no longer belongs to the world above it. A time when windows reflect only the insides, and silence becomes something thicker than air. I hadn't planned on waking so early, but my body had moved without invitation. A kind of instinct, like a tremor through my bones. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, not moving, listening. The house breathed. It didn't speak. Downstairs, I made coffee the old way, grinding the beans by hand, heating the kettle, pouring slowly. The process mattered. Noise without meaning only invites chaos. I waited for the steam to rise in its usual spiral, poured the dark liquid into my cup, and carried it to the study. There, next to the desk drawer, was the terminal I had built from the old parts I trusted. No wireless sync, no cloud, just a quiet system that lived and died on its own terms. I powered it up. The monitor blinked awake, pale green text against black. No sound, no icons, just a prompt and a blinking cursor, like a heartbeat waiting for a command. I typed in the new authorization phrase, a sentence only I would remember. It was the first thing my wife had said to me when we met. I never wrote it down, never shared it. But now, it opened the system like a whispered password to a secret world. The security grid came alive. I reviewed the logs. Every motion, every entry point, every deviation from the usual. It was all there, neatly archived. Her late-night movements, the rearranged objects, the missing bottles. She hadn't just visited. She had stayed, slept somewhere, moved through the house like a ghost who believed it had inherited the place. But it wasn't hers. I sipped the coffee slowly, watching the cursor blink in the corner. And then, with a few keystrokes, I initiated the change. The code. The one she thought was hers. Her birthday. 4 digits she'd said were easy to remember. Easy, yes. Lazy. Presumptuous. I erased it. In its place, I entered a new sequence, a date only I would know. It was the day we bought the house, 37 years ago. Not the day we moved in, not the day we closed the sale, but the exact day we first walked through the door and looked at each other, knowing it would be ours. That date was etched into the back of an old keychain she had given me as a joke, the one that said, "Home is where you fix the leaky roof." I still carried it. The system accepted the change without question. No fanfare, no warning, just quiet confirmation. Code accepted. Lockout protocols updated. Administrator reset. From that moment forward, she no longer had access. Not to the doors, not to the cameras, not to the system. I leaned back in the chair and let the silence settle. It was different now, deeper somehow, like the house had taken a breath and held it. I finished my coffee, turned off the monitor, and left the study without turning on the lights. Let the dark remain intact. By mid-morning, the house had changed. Not physically. The walls still held their secrets, but the locks obeyed only me. The sensors whispered only to me. The lights responded to my patterns, not hers. She didn't know it yet, but she was a guest again, a visitor. She arrived just before noon. I heard the tires on the gravel. Not fast, casual, confident. The door opened, and she approached the front steps. I remained in the back room, seated near the display that showed each camera's feed in quiet rotation. She tried the handle. It resisted. She looked at the keypad, typed something, waited. Nothing. She tried again. Still nothing. I watched as confusion crept into her posture. She stepped back, looked up at the camera over the door. Her eyes narrowed. Then she took out her phone, called someone, paced, waited. No one answered. She tried the side door next, then the rear. Each denied her. Her hands moved quickly now, growing frustrated. She spoke into the air, cursing maybe, or commanding. It didn't matter. The house didn't hear her anymore. She walked the perimeter once, stopping near the garage window. I had covered that feed with a blackout filter. No entry, no vision. Still, she pressed her face to the glass, then knocked, as if knocking would undo what she had undone. I sat motionless, watching the screens as she circled back to the front. She stood there for a long time. I could see her trying to remember if she'd ever changed the code herself, if she'd written it down, if maybe someone else had done this without her knowledge. But there was no one else. Only me. Eventually, she stepped back from the porch. She stared at the house like it was lying to her, like it had betrayed her. She didn't understand yet that it had never belonged to her. Not truly. She had lived in it, walked through it, poured drinks and rearranged furniture. But she hadn't listened to it, hadn't respected its memory. I had. The cameras recorded everything, every glance, every movement, every pause where she almost knocked again, almost called my name. She didn't. Instead, she walked away. When the car finally rolled back down the driveway, I didn't move. I sat in the stillness until the dust had settled and the screens had gone dim. Then I turned off the display, stood slowly, and walked to the front door. I opened it. The porch was empty. The air was clean. The sun touched the edges of the railing, and the wind moved through the chimes with a hollow metallic whisper. I stepped outside, closed the door behind me, and stood at the top of the steps for a long while. No sounds, no cars, just the rustle of trees and the soft groan of old wood beneath my feet. The house had spoken, and it had chosen. The morning after I changed the code, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't peace, not relief either, just a hard-edged awareness, the kind I used to wake with back when deadlines loomed and every wire had to be run with precision. There was a purpose to the day, and in that purpose, I found something steady. I sat at the kitchen table with a fountain pen and a blank sheet of archival paper, the kind we had once used for official documentation, letters of intent, and binding agreements. The pen had weight. The paper had texture. I didn't want an email. I didn't want a text message. I wanted ink. I wanted paper. I wanted something real. I began to write. At first, I hesitated, staring at the blankness. So many things had happened that demanded explanation, confrontation, even accusation. But I wasn't writing to her. Not directly. I was writing about her, and I was writing to someone who would understand the language I was using. The only person I trusted with the kind of information I was about to share. I wrote down the dates first, timestamps, camera entries, movement logs, the night she entered, the moments she lingered, the bottle of wine that appeared and vanished, the adjusted photographs, the missing keys. Each detail had its place, catalogued not out of paranoia, but out of a habit formed over decades of needing evidence to make decisions. Then came the annotations, the interpretation. I described her behavior, her body language, the inconsistencies in her routine. I included observations on tone and timing, on how often she returned to certain rooms. I noted the stack of real estate documents in the attic, the photos of her with strangers in the house, the celebratory banners tucked away like prizes awaiting permission. I described the handwriting on the projected renovation budgets, the underlined phrases, the arithmetic margins carved out of a life that wasn't hers. I included photos, printed stills from the cameras, blurry at the edges, time-stamped, but clear in content. Her face, her posture, her gestures, her indifference. They were not explosive, not dramatic. They were just moments, enough to suggest a pattern, enough to suggest motive. Then I paused. There was a part of the letter I didn't know how to begin. Not the data, not the footage, not the summary. The part about what she meant to me. The part about the girl I once carried on my shoulders through snowdrifts. The girl who used to fall asleep in my lap during storms. How do you write that into evidence? How do you attach warmth to a file that is cold by necessity? I tried. I wrote about her childhood, briefly, her intelligence, her energy, her mother's pride. I wrote about how she had changed, not with bitterness, but with a kind of clinical honesty, a shift in tone, a hardening of eyes, the long distance between us that began as ambition and ended in something else, something that moved through this house like a draft through an open window in winter. Then I came to the final page. I summarized everything. I stated clearly that I no longer believed she had my well-being in mind, that her presence in the house had violated not just privacy, but memory, that I had reason to believe she intended to sell the property, that she had already involved external parties, and that, as the legal owner, I was invoking the clause of irrevocable control previously established in the deed revision my wife and I filed 7 years ago. I attached a copy. I signed my full name at the bottom. It had been a long time since I'd seen it that way, not just scribbled initials on receipts, but the full name. It looked foreign to me for a moment. Strange how quickly we forget the authority in our own signature. I placed the letter in a manila envelope, along with the documents, the photographs, and a flash drive that contained every frame of footage. I sealed it, taped the corners, wrote the name of the recipient on the front. It wasn't hers. It wasn't even a lawyer, not exactly. It was a man named Frederick Caro, an old colleague, now retired, who had once handled security for judicial records in Albany. He had helped me file the last deed revision when my daughter began behaving erratically after my wife's diagnosis. He had watched over the estate documents, quietly, with no fanfare. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but his word was still good. His loyalty was older than her ambition. That afternoon, I drove to the small post office 3 towns over. I didn't want to use the one nearby. Too familiar, too traceable. I handed the envelope to the clerk, paid in cash, and asked for delivery confirmation. No tracking, no signature required on the other end, just proof that it arrived. When I returned home, the house felt different again. Not lighter, not yet, but steadier, as though it had been waiting for me to take one more step, to restore a piece of balance that had been missing. I placed a copy of the letter inside the safe, alongside my wife's will, the original title to the house, and the handwritten note she had once left me on a torn grocery list. Don't forget who you are. I didn't. That night, I ate alone. I left the lights dimmed and the windows open. The sound of wind through the trees filled the room like quiet music. I lit one candle. Not for her, not for me, for the room itself, as if giving it permission to breathe again. The next morning, a small white envelope appeared in the mailbox. It had no return address. Inside was a card. It read, in clean looping script, "I received your letter. I understand. FC." Nothing more, nothing less. It was enough. It happened just after noon. The sun had climbed high enough to cast long rectangles of light across the wooden floor, illuminating the dust in slow, deliberate motion. I had just finished my second cup of black coffee and was sitting in the dining room, reviewing the surveillance reports from the night before. Everything had been still. No movement, no shadows, no returning footsteps in the gravel. But I had learned not to relax when things were still. Stillness was rarely a gesture of peace. More often, it was the inhale before the strike. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of the old wall clock above the mantel. I didn't keep it wound to tell time. It had long since lost its precision. I kept it because of its voice. The slow, persistent tick kept the house from sounding dead. My wife used to say that the tick reminded her that there was always something worth doing. The glass broke with the sound of a sharp, unexpected breath. A clean shatter, not muffled by cloth or carpet. Hard surface. No hesitation. It was the kind of sound that sent your body into motion before your mind had a chance to shape the cause. I stood up so quickly, the chair scraped against the floor, its legs barking against the boards. The sound had come from the front room. I moved quietly through the hall, my footsteps practiced, intentional. The cameras had already captured the moment. I would review the feed later, but right now, I wanted my eyes to witness it first. The front room, once a parlor, then later my wife's favorite reading space, was filled with light. The sun through the large windows made everything look falsely serene. But there it was. On the floor, a champagne flute, shattered into 7 or 8 clean shards, with its stem broken at the neck. Beside it, a faint pool of liquid spreading slowly across the wood in a shape like a question mark. The wine bottle sat on the side table, half empty, and in the armchair across from it, my daughter. She didn't speak. I didn't either. She sat with one leg crossed over the other, her back straight, her shoulders drawn in tight, like someone who had just been told a very uncomfortable truth. In her hand, she held a second flute, unbroken, but trembling slightly. Her gaze didn't meet mine. It was fixed on the fireplace. The room was thick with the scent of the wine, something dry, bitter, something meant for celebration, now repurposed for disappointment. I could see that she had been sitting here for some time. The cushion beneath her was compressed deeply, the throw pillow beside her tossed onto the floor. On the table was a manila folder, closed, sealed, untouched. I walked past her without a word, picked up the pieces of glass with a cloth from the sideboard, and dropped them gently into a metal waste bin. The sound of each shard hitting the bottom echoed through the room like punctuation. She didn't move. I noticed then that she was wearing the same sweater my wife had once gifted her, ivory wool with fine threading at the collar. It had sat untouched in her closet for years. She had called it too conservative once. Now it hung loosely over her frame like something borrowed from another era, another life. I reached for the folder. My name was written on the front. Not Dad, not Father, just my full name. Formal, legal. I opened it. Inside were documents I recognized instantly. The sale agreement, preliminary assessments, stamped pages from a notary, a letter of intent from a private buyer. All unsigned, all halted. Attached with a clip was a handwritten note on lined paper, folded into thirds. I unfolded it slowly. It was brief. She had written about confusion, miscommunication, her belief that things had already been set in motion long before the funeral. She apologized, not for her actions, but for the timing. She said she had misunderstood the nature of the trust and that she hadn't read the full deed revisions until recently. She admitted the house was never hers to sell, that the inheritance was conditional, that the foundation now had partial rights to the preservation of the property. She had known none of that, she wrote, until the letter arrived from Caro. She closed the note with one sentence. I didn't think it would matter to you. I folded the paper, placed it back inside the folder, and set it on the table. She finally looked at me. There was no plea in her eyes, no resistance either, just something slack, like someone who had reached the last page of a long book and realized the story hadn't ended the way they imagined. Not a tragedy, not a triumph, just a conclusion. I turned away. As I reached the doorway, the remaining glass in her hand slipped, not intentionally, not dramatically. It tilted as she tried to adjust her grip, caught the edge of the chair arm, and fell. The stem hit the floor first. It didn't shatter like the first. It broke in two, a clean snap, quiet, almost respectful. She didn't react. I left her there. In the hallway, I paused by the console and reviewed the alert log. The system had registered her re-entry an hour earlier. She had used the rear door. The code she had once used no longer worked. She had called out, waited, knocked, then sat on the porch for 27 minutes before I disengaged the lock remotely. I had let her in, but the house didn't. Upstairs, I changed into a clean shirt and opened the windows to let the wind move through the room. I returned the fountain pen to the drawer, slid the notebook closed, and straightened the pile of paperwork on my desk. Downstairs, the glass stayed on the floor. I didn't pick it up this time. That sound, the second glass breaking, was different from the first. It wasn't an alarm. It wasn't a warning. It was a kind of acceptance, not loud, not final. Just a soft echo of something slipping out of reach. The morning after the broken glass, the house felt different. Not lighter, not relieved, but balanced, even. Like something long misaligned had finally been nudged back into place. The silence, which had grown thick and watchful over the past week, now settled like a sleeping dog, still present, still alert, but no longer tense. I rose earlier than usual, before the light had fully reached over the horizon. I brewed coffee without rushing, letting the sounds of the old kitchen fill the space. The groan of the cabinet door, the click of the burner, the whine of the kettle. Rituals had always mattered to me, even in the smallest forms. They framed the day, made it legible, especially on a morning like this. I dressed with care, not for ceremony, not for theater, just deliberately. A pressed shirt, slacks without wrinkles, the old watch my wife had given me decades ago when my hands still shook during government presentations. The leather band was cracked now, but it still held fast. I adjusted the buckle one notch tighter and looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror. It was important to look steady when the consequences arrived. By 9 o'clock, the car pulled into the driveway. I had expected it, not because they had called ahead, they hadn't, but because consequences move on schedules, even when people don't. They always arrive eventually, with or without permission. 2 men stepped out. One wore a navy blazer with an open collar, a clipboard in his hand, and the weight of someone used to signing papers, others regret. The other was younger, suit button too high, phone already in hand, scanning the property as if preparing a catalog. I watched them through the front window without moving. My daughter arrived a few minutes later. Her car parked farther down, angled slightly, as though even now she didn't want to fully commit to the scene. She stepped out carefully, dressed not in black, not in gray, but in a pale, neutral beige, a color that tried not to say anything at all. The 3 of them approached the porch. I opened the door before they knocked. The older man gave me a nod, brief but not impolite. The younger one looked past me into the hallway. My daughter's eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, then dropped to the floorboards. I stepped aside and let them in. The formalities began quickly. Inspection, documentation, confirmation of ownership transfer under the new agreement. The foundation representative, the man with the blazer, spoke with precise language, detailing the terms of the preservation contract, the responsibilities of the trust, the conditions under which renovations could or could not be made. The younger one took photos, marked measurements, ran his fingers along the baseboards like he was searching for something hidden. I let them speak, let them walk, let them take their notes. In the dining room, they paused. The fireplace drew their attention. Its old stonework, the hand-carved mantel, the date chiseled into the brick. My wife's favorite part of the house, one of the only things we had never repainted or updated. It would be preserved now, untouched, maintained exactly as it was. They approved. The man with the blazer turned toward me and said something official, something about appreciation for my cooperation, my attention to legacy, the value of family history and community heritage projects. His words were well rehearsed, practiced, and like most practiced things, hollow. I nodded once and said nothing. The young one moved to the stairs. He asked permission with a glance. I gave a small gesture of assent. He climbed slowly, camera in hand, eyes sharp. My daughter remained in the living room, standing near the bookshelf, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She didn't speak. I didn't ask her to. As the minutes passed, I watched her. She walked to the window once, peeked through the curtain. She touched the edge of the armchair, the one she used to fall asleep in when she was 7 and feverish, the same one my wife had reupholstered by hand because a child should have softness to return to. Her hand dropped from the chair, and she looked at me again, longer this time. Her mouth opened slightly, but the sound didn't come. She seemed to think better of it and turned back toward the bookshelf, staring at titles she'd never read. The inspector came back down, nodded to his colleague, then to me. All accounted for. Everything confirmed. The documents were ready. The clipboard appeared, papers clipped neatly in place, black ink pen waiting beside the signature line. The older man held it out, polite but firm. I didn't hesitate. I took the pen. I signed my name, slowly, cleanly, not as a gesture of finality, but of continuity, of endurance. My name, my hand, my house. The pen clicked closed. The man took the clipboard, offered a handshake. I accepted it briefly. Then they left. They said they'd return next week with the full preservation team, that the press release would go out by Thursday, that a plaque would be placed near the front walkway in the coming months. Historical significance, legacy, all the phrases people use when they want to honor what they nearly allowed to be destroyed. The door closed behind them. Silence. My daughter remained. She stood near the middle of the room, not knowing what to do with her hands. She looked older than she had the week before, not because of time, but because of weight. The kind that doesn't sit on the shoulders, but beneath the skin. She walked slowly to the chair and sat. No words, no movement, just presence. For the first time in days, I sat across from her. Not in confrontation, not in distance, just across. I didn't ask her why. She didn't offer answers. The house, for the first time in what felt like weeks, held its silence without tension. No steps above, no quiet manipulations, no whisper of wires humming in defense. Just quiet. And truth. The kind that doesn't come from speeches, the kind that doesn't ask for applause, the kind that simply stands and stays. It was almost dusk when I found it. The last of the sun stretched low and gold across the living room floor, painting the old rugs in long slanted stripes. I had no intention of searching for anything that day. I wasn't digging anymore, wasn't tracing footprints or watching motion logs. The house was quiet, and for the first time in weeks, it wasn't the silence of waiting. It was the silence of aftermath. I had been rearranging the shelf in the bedroom, not for order, but for space. I wanted a place to rest the watch box, the one with the broken hinge and my wife's initials carved into the soft mahogany. I'd kept it beside my bed for years, always meaning to repair the latch. Now it felt like something sacred, too fragile to fix, too precious to throw away. While clearing the second shelf, I moved an old quilted box we had once used to hold letters. Not many were left inside, just a few birthday cards from decades past, a set of dried flowers pressed between two blank pages, and tucked flat beneath a stack of envelopes, a small leather-bound notebook. It was pale brown, almost sand-colored, with a soft texture worn smooth at the corners. No lock, no clasp, just a band of faded ribbon tucked between the middle pages. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. The handwriting was hers. Small, elegant, slanted slightly to the right. Her lines always curved gently inward, like the words were folding into themselves, trying to stay quiet. I had seen this script before, on grocery lists, in thank you cards, in the margin of cookbooks, but never like this. This was different. This was personal. It was a diary, and from the ink and pressure, I could tell it had been written late in her life. The first few pages were simple reflections, garden updates, notes about the weather, observations about the neighbor's dog who always barked at the same time each evening. But as I turned the pages, the tone shifted. Her thoughts deepened. She had written less frequently, but with more weight. Entire entries compressed into single paragraphs, as if each word had been measured before being allowed onto the page. She had written about the house, about its changing atmosphere, about how the walls seemed to listen differently when I wasn't home, how the energy shifted when our daughter visited, how laughter in the wrong room could sound like an alarm. She didn't accuse. She didn't even speculate. She simply observed. There was one entry that made me pause. It was dated 6 months before her passing. She stopped knocking before coming in. She moves through the rooms like they've already been promised to her. Gerald doesn't see it. He still thinks time will smooth it all out. But the house feels it. Every object moved too quickly. Every drawer opened too long. This isn't a daughter visiting her parents. It's a scout charting a route. I closed the book briefly, let the weight of her words sit with me. She had noticed, earlier than I had. She had noticed the same shift in posture, the same casual entitlement that I had mistaken for grief dressed as busyness. She had seen it, measured it, and kept it quietly on paper. I flipped to the next page. There is a coldness that lives behind smiles now. Not always, but enough. Enough that I've started locking the cabinet in the hall. Enough that I count the wine bottles after she leaves. It's not paranoia. its pattern. The next few entries were scattered, shorter. Then came a section in a darker ink, written in slightly shakier hand. I've made peace with the leaving, not the dying, but the fading, the soft, slow way a body prepares itself to go. But I don't want the house to be taken apart. I don't want it remodeled. It's not just walls. It's not just wood. It's a record. Every inch is a sentence in a story we spent decades writing together. If he can't protect it, I hope someone will remind him what it meant, what it still means, what it holds. I read that page 3 times. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a plea. It was a wish, written not in desperation, but in quiet hope. She hadn't asked me to fight. She hadn't asked me to act. But she had hoped I'd remember, that I'd understand what she'd built here, not just the garden or the furniture or the warmth in the curtains, but the memory of presence, the identity of place. There were only a few pages left. One near the end had been dated the week before she passed. He still makes tea every morning, still folds the dish towel over the sink rail just right, still reads in silence. I think he knows. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to feel the edges of change. I want to tell him it's okay to be stubborn now. He's earned it. This house listens to him the way it once listened to me. The final page was undated, just a single line, written in blue ink. Don't let her turn the walls into noise. I closed the book. The ribbon still marked the middle. My fingers rested on the cover for a long time, unmoving. The room around me was lit now by the full weight of dusk, that heavy amber that stretches across everything and makes time feel like something slower. I could hear the sound of the wind against the side of the house, the old tree branches brushing the siding. I placed the diary back into the quilted box, then carried it down the hallway to the safe behind the study panel. I didn't lock it away out of fear. I locked it because it belonged among the truths we kept sacred, not hidden, just preserved. That night, I lit a single lamp in the corner of the living room. I sat in the same chair she used to favor when reading on cold evenings. I didn't read. I didn't write. I just listened. And the house, in return, said nothing. But it didn't feel empty. The light was different that morning. Not softer, just quieter. The kind of light that didn't announce itself through windows, but crept in slowly, adjusting itself to the corners of the room. I noticed it first in the way it touched the floor by the kitchen doorway, catching the edge of the old woven rug she had always insisted was too faded to throw out. I followed that light through the house, not because I was curious, but because that was how the day wanted to begin. I opened the front door before the clock struck 7. The air was damp with spring, not wet, but full, the way it gets just before something blooms. The wood of the porch creaked beneath my slippers, still holding on to the chill from the night. I stepped outside and pulled the screen door shut behind me, letting it catch with that familiar slow hiss of the old hydraulic closer. I didn't bring coffee. I didn't bring a newspaper. I brought only the blanket, the same one she had knitted in 1986, when her hands still moved without pain, and the world still spun slightly faster. Blue and green, with threads of gray now faded into something closer to silver. I draped it across my lap as I sat down in the rocking chair, the one she had given me on my 50th birthday, the one with the slight crack in the right armrest that I had meant to fix for over a decade, but never did. It groaned in welcome as I leaned back and let the rhythm begin. The neighborhood had not woken yet. The birds were only just starting their song, tentative and low, like a rehearsal before a performance they weren't quite ready to give. The breeze stirred through the trees with a gentleness I hadn't felt in months. For a moment, the world felt suspended, as though nothing new had happened, as though the weight of the past few weeks was still waiting at the edge of the property, deciding whether or not to re-enter. Then I saw it. A shadow at the far end of the porch. Not a movement, not a figure, just a presence. It hovered near the last post, right where the morning light caught the latticework and fractured it into broken squares across the floorboards. It wasn't hers, not exactly, but it reminded me of her, not the version she had become, not the woman who wandered the rooms with phone calls and folders and plans she never truly explained. This shadow felt older, familiar, slower. It felt like memory. I didn't move. I didn't look directly at it. I just sat and listened. And the house, my house, listened too. I could feel its breath in the way the wind rattled the hanging chimes, each note soft and low, like a lullaby no one had sung in years. I could feel it in the grain of the wood beneath my hands, warm now, no longer resisting the morning. The porch had always been our place, where we began the days, where we ended them, where she read, and I watched the trees, and the space between us needed no filling. I leaned forward and rested my elbows on my knees. My hands hung between them, loose, old, familiar. I stared out into the yard. The grass had grown a little too long in the past week. I'd have to trim it before the end of the month. The bird bath needed cleaning. One of the garden stones had shifted out of place. But it wasn't decay. It was life. Life that had been paused and was now resuming at its own pace. There had been no confrontation, no screaming matches, no final declarations. Only a quiet unraveling followed by an even quieter reclamation. And that, I had learned, was the truest kind of ending. Not the one that demanded applause or tears, just one that settled into place, like the last piece of a puzzle you had spent years assembling, only to find that it had been in your pocket the entire time. The shadow didn't leave. It stayed, but it didn't weigh anything. I watched it stretch across the porch as the sun climbed higher. It became longer, softer, then slowly dissolved into the planks as the light changed. By the time it disappeared, I realized I had been rocking steadily the entire time. My hands were still folded. The blanket was still warm, and for the first time in many mornings, my back didn't ache. The screen door creaked again behind me, not from use, but from the settling of the frame in the rising heat. I turned slightly, letting my gaze fall on the welcome mat, the one she had bought 5 years ago when we thought company still meant something. It read, "Come as you are." The words had faded almost completely, but I could still make them out if I looked just right. I sat a while longer. No alarms, no interruptions, just the quiet presence of a house that had remembered what it was, and the man who had remembered with it.